May 1st, 1893, Chicago. The world's Columbian Exposition opened its gates, and for 6 months, 27 million visitors walked through what they called the White City. Over 200 gleaming buildings spread across Jackson Park. I've seen the photographs hundreds of times, but when I first pulled the official blueprints from the Chicago History Museum archive, something stopped me cold. The main entrances weren't decorative archways or grand cathedral doors. They were standard doors, specified at 11 feet 4 inches tall. Let that sink in. The average American man in 1893 stood 5'7". Why would architects build doors nearly twice the height of the people walking through them? At first, I thought it was an anomaly. Then I found the same dimensions in San Francisco's 1894 Midwinter Fair. Then St. Louis's 1904 World's Fair. Then dozens of permanent courthouses and capitol buildings from that same era. This wasn't aesthetics, it was functional. When I finally measured those door heights against human proportions from the same period, the numbers weren't just large, they were physically impossible to build by accident. And that's when I realized the scale wasn't for decoration, it was for function. What this suggests is disturbing. The people who built these structures weren't our size, and someone made sure we forgot. So I spent 9 months digging through architectural records, newspaper accounts, and photographs that have been systematically cropped. Let me show you what I found.
Let me back up and tell you how I stumbled into this. I started where a lot of people do, the Tartaria forums, the theory that a lost global empire existed before some kind of reset in the 1800s. I was skeptical. Honestly, I told myself the oversized doors were just forced perspective or camera distortion. Then I found an uncropped photograph from 1893. It showed workers standing next to one of those exposition doors. These were average height men in hats and vests, maybe 5'10". The door handle was mounted at 8 feet. These men reached up to touch it, their arms stretched straight overhead, fingers barely grazing metal. The door itself rose another 3 feet above that. Something clicked. I spent 9 months traveling to 14 archives: Chicago, San Francisco, St. Louis, Washington, D.C. I examined over 300 original blueprints and photographs. My initial doubt became certainty. What I found wasn't just a curiosity about old buildings. It was a systematic erasure of evidence that a race of giants, guardians of a lost civilization, once walked the earth. Let me show you exactly what I mean, starting with 3 buildings you can still visit today. The first example is still standing in San Francisco. Most people walk right past it without noticing.
The first example is still standing in San Francisco. Most people walk right past it without noticing. I'm talking about the Ferry Building, completed in 1898. Go there today. Bring a tape measure. The main entrance doors measure 10 feet 8 inches tall. That's not a typo. 10 feet 8 inches. The average man in the 1890s stood 5'7". Those doors are nearly twice his height. Now head to Chicago, the Cultural Center on Michigan Avenue, originally the city's public library, built in 1897. Walk inside and look up. The first floor ceilings hit 12 feet. The doorways, minimum 9 feet 6 inches. And they're original, not a renovation. Then there's Buffalo City Hall, completed in 1931, 3 decades later and still following the pattern. Entrance doors at 10 feet, lobbies at 14 feet. I could add St. Louis, Philadelphia, Boston. The list keeps growing. But here's the quantity that broke my brain. Over 200 civic buildings built between 1880 and 1920 share these dimensions. 200. Not 5, not 20. 200 buildings across America, all with entrance doors between 9 and 12 feet tall, all with ceiling heights exceeding 12 feet on the first floor. The same 11-foot entrance doors appear in every single one. That's not architectural diversity. That's a building code for a different-sized population. Think about the humanizing detail for a second. The average man in 1890 was 5'7". These doors are twice that. You can't explain that away as style. Style changes.
Function doesn't. You can visit the San Francisco Ferry Building today. Bring a tape measure. I did. But here's where it gets impossible to explain away. These aren't isolated examples. The same dimensions appear in buildings on 3 continents, all built within the same 20-year window. So I brought the measurements to an architectural historian. What they told me made the hair stand up on my neck.
So I brought my measurements to someone who actually knows what she's talking about. Dr. Elena Valsquez, architectural historian at UC Berkeley. She's a registered architect with a PhD, and she literally wrote the book on World's Fair architecture. Her 2019 paper in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians changed how we think about exposition buildings. I asked her a simple question. Why would architects in the 1890s build doors averaging 11 feet 4 inches tall? For context, a standard residential door today is 6 feet 8 inches. Commercial doors, 7 feet. These exposition doors were nearly 60% taller. Her answer stopped me cold. She said those dimensions weren't decorative. They were functional. Here's why. Ergonomic studies show that an optimal door height is roughly twice the average user's height plus 6 inches for clearance. Do the math. For a 5'9" human, that's 6 feet 8 inches, exactly what we use today. For an 8-foot human, that's 10 feet 8 inches. For an 11-foot human, that's 13 feet 4 inches. The exposition doors I measured fall right in that 9 to 12-foot range.
Optimized for people 7 to 9 feet tall. Then we looked at stair risers, the vertical distance between steps. Period buildings from 1880 to 1920 used risers averaging 7.2 inches. Modern standard for 5'9" humans is 6.5 inches. A 7.2-inch riser means longer femurs. Longer femurs mean taller people. You can't fudge that. It's biomechanics. Dr. Vasquez and I ran a statistical analysis on 150 buildings from that era. Door heights, ceiling heights, riser measurements, handle mounting points. The probability that these dimensions occurred by chance? Less than 1/10 of 1%. 0.1%. Let me say that again. There is a less than 1 in 1,000 chance that architects across America independently decided to build doors twice as tall as necessary, stairs suited for longer legs, and ceilings 12 feet high, all without coordination. This was not accidental. These architects weren't designing for aesthetics. They were designing for function, for occupants significantly larger than us. So if this was intentional engineering, buildings scaled for giants, who built them, and why did they disappear? To answer that, we need to look at who the Tartarians were and what the historical record says about their physical stature.
So who were these people? Let me introduce you to the Tartarians. I'm not talking about a mythical empire of monsters. Tartaria appears on maps from the 1600s through the 1800s, a vast region spanning Russia, Siberia, and Central Asia. But some researchers, myself included after this investigation, argue it was something more, a global civilization with advanced architectural knowledge. And the people who built those oversized structures, they weren't conquerors, they were guardians. A larger statured people, likely 7 to 9 feet tall, who served as builders, protectors, and knowledge keepers. Their knowledge wasn't written in books. It was transmitted through guild systems, Freemasons, cathedral builders, stonemason lodges. You didn't learn from a textbook. You spent 7 to 14 years as an apprentice, working alongside a master, measuring with your own body. That's why you can't find blueprints explaining how to cut stone for a 10-foot man. The knowledge was embodied. You learned by doing. And these builders were astonishingly sophisticated. Consider this. Chicago's tallest building in 1893 wasn't a skyscraper by modern standards, but the Masonic Temple stood 302 feet tall, 22 stories, and was completed in 1892. That's not centuries of gradual advancement. That's a civilization that knew exactly what it was doing. The Tartarian builders operated on a global scale. Exposition buildings rose simultaneously in Chicago, Paris, London, St. Louis, and San Francisco. 4 continents, same decade, same impossible dimensions. And then, between 1893 and 1904,
Just 11 years. Virtually all of these massive exposition buildings were demolished. The people who built them disappeared. The records systematically archived and sealed. The timing of their disappearance coincides almost perfectly with the rise of a new historical narrative, one that had no room for giants or lost civilizations.
Now let me show you the timing that turned this from interesting to disturbing. Tartaria had appeared on world maps for 300 years. Mercator, Ortelius, all the major cartographers. Then, between 1850 and 1900, it vanished. The last major map showing Tartaria was 1844. By 1900, the name was gone, erased. Now overlay that with something else. The era of world's fairs begins exactly then. 1851 London, 1853 New York, 1876 Philadelphia, 1893 Chicago, 1904 St. Louis. Massive exposition buildings constructed in months, showcased for a season, then demolished. Within the same 50-year window, not centuries apart, not even decades apart, the exact same decades. And here's where it gets stranger. Between 1880 and 1920, newspaper reports of giant skeleton excavations peaked. Headlines you can still read. Giant bones unearthed in Ohio. 9-foot skeleton found in Tennessee. Then the Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846, right at the start of this window, began collecting these remains, acquiring them, and losing them. Today, not one is on public display. So let's list the synchronicities.
1. Tartaria erased from maps. 2. World's fairs explode globally. 3. Giant skeleton reports peak. 4. The Smithsonian begins collecting and suppressing those remains. 4 unrelated phenomena, all converging in the same 50 years. The statistical probability of that happening by chance is astronomical, which forces a reframing. What if the world's fairs weren't celebrating industrial progress? What if they were showcasing the ruins of a lost civilization, dressed up as new construction to hide what came before? To understand how this coordinated erasure was possible, we need to look at the legal and economic mechanisms that made it happen. In 1881, something happened that changed everything. A piece of legislation that gave the Smithsonian Institution and its allies extraordinary power over what you were allowed to know. So, what actually happened in 1881? The Smithsonian Institution received its mandate to collect archaeological specimens for what would become the U.S. National Museum. The official explanation sounded benign, preserving American history and natural sciences for future generations. But here's what the official record doesn't emphasize. Internal documents obtained by researchers through FOIA requests show a specific, targeted interest in what they called anomalous remains, skeletons exceeding 7 feet in length. Between 1881 and 1900, Smithsonian accession records indicate the acquisition of at least 52 skeletons over 7 feet 6 inches tall. Several of these were reported in local newspapers as 9 to 12 feet in length. Farmers digging wells, railroad workers blasting through hillsides. They'd uncover massive bones, call a local professor, and within weeks, Smithsonian agents would arrive, collect the remains, and issue a press release calling it a hoax or a misidentified bison. Today, exactly 0 of those 52 skeletons are on public display. 0. I visited the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I've walked through the bone rooms you can access.
Nothing. The accession files for these specimens marked missing, destroyed, or withheld under FOIA exemptions for ongoing research that has been ongoing for over a century. But the Smithsonian wasn't acting alone. Across the Atlantic, the British Museum showed the exact same pattern. Giant remains acquired in the 1890s, catalogued, then lost during the 1906 reorganization. The Louvre, the Hermitage, same story. Acquire, publicize briefly, then quietly misplace. Why? Because the existence of giants, a race of 7 to 9 foot builders, threatened the narrative.
The narrative that Native Americans were the only pre-Columbian inhabitants. The narrative that human height has remained constant. The narrative that progress is linear and we've never lost anything important. Who benefited from this erasure? The academic anthropology establishment, built on the premise that no advanced civilization predated known history. Smithsonian leadership, whose reputations depended on that premise. And the political forces of manifest destiny, who needed a continent empty of any people who might question who really built those mounds, those structures, those cities. But the suppression didn't stop with bones. It extended to architecture, to photographs, to written accounts, anything that suggested giants were real. And this wasn't just happening in America. Across the Atlantic, the same methods were being deployed, the same buildings demolished, the same records sealed.
And when I say the same methods, I mean exactly the same. Across 4 continents. The British Museum in London, giant skeletons acquired in the 1890s, then lost in the 1906 reorganization. The Musée de l'Homme in Paris, same pattern. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, same. The Australian Museum in Sydney, same. Between 1880 and 1920, every major museum on Earth began acquiring anomalously large skeletons. Newspaper reporters would show up, headlines would run. Then, silence. The specimens would be quietly reclassified as pathological or of doubtful authenticity, or simply marked missing from the accession logs. How do you coordinate a global cover-up without the internet? The answer is as disturbing as the pattern itself. The emerging global scientific establishment had its own network, museums exchanging journals, universities sharing specimens, anthropological societies setting professional standards. And somewhere in those journals, in those private letters, in those closed-door meetings, a consensus formed. No giants, no pre-Columbian advanced civilizations, no Tartaria. The evidence didn't disappear by accident. It was systematically reclassified out of existence. 4 continents, 6 major museums, over 100 giant skeletons, by some estimates, acquired and then vanished. As if everyone agreed to forget overnight. So what exactly was lost when these skeletons and the people they belonged to were erased from history? To understand what we lost, look at what we can no longer do and what we once could. So let me show you exactly what we lost. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City, included the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building. 30 acres under one roof, built in 6 months. Its largest span was 1,200 feet, a record that stood for 70 years. Think about that. 6 months. Today, a convention center of that size takes 2 to 3 years to design and build, using cranes, steel, and computer modeling. The Tartarian builders, these giant guardians, worked with stone blocks weighing 50 to 100 tons, moved them without machinery, set them with precision that still holds after 130 years. We can measure the blocks, we can measure the building speeds, we can measure the architectural harmony, but we cannot replicate the process. Here's why. The knowledge wasn't in the tools. It was in the bodies. A 9-foot builder can lift what a 5'9" builder needs a crane for. A 9-foot builder's stride determines stair riser height. A 9-foot builder's eye level sets door handle mounting points. You cannot write that down. You cannot transfer that through a blueprint. It was embodied knowledge, passed through 7 to 14 years of apprenticeship, working shoulder to shoulder with a master who was also 7 to 9 feet tall. When the giants disappeared, the embodied knowledge disappeared with them. We are technological orphans. We inherited the buildings but cannot build them again. We can walk through 12-foot doorways and never understand why they were made that way. That's the grief of it. We measure their work and marvel at it, but we are children playing in rooms built by parents twice our size. And if this knowledge could be erased, entire building techniques, stone cutting methods, architectural proportions,
What else might be disappearing from history right now while we're not looking? Which brings us to today. Because this isn't ancient history. It's happening again.
Which brings us to today. Because if the Smithsonian and British Museum systematically erased giant evidence 130 years ago, what are they doing right now? Here's what I'm watching happen in real time. First, alternative history researchers, myself included, are getting demonetized and shadow banned on YouTube for using words like giant and Tartaria. Our videos get age restricted. Our comments disappear. The algorithm treats photographs of old buildings like violent content. Second, museums have tightened access to their anthropological collections. You now need a PhD and institutional affiliation just to request a viewing. The same collections where giant skeletons are supposedly held. Third, textbook publishers are quietly removing references to anomalous pre-Columbian civilizations. Your kids' textbooks are being edited right now. Then versus now. The Smithsonian acquired 52 giant skeletons and displayed 0. Today, museums hold giant remains and allow 0 public access. The methods changed, the power structures didn't. The academic establishment, museum curators, publishing gatekeepers, they're still in control. And they're still suppressing evidence that doesn't fit the narrative. You can see this happening if you watch your recommended feed disappear. But here's what you can do. Document the oversized doors in your town. File FOIA requests for museum accession records. Share what you find before it's erased. Which brings us back to where we started, with a 12-foot doorway in San Francisco and a question. Who decided giants aren't real? So what do we do with this information? Let me leave you with 4 questions and one thing you can do today. I don't have all the answers. I'm not claiming I found a giant skeleton in a museum basement, but I have found pattern after pattern, all pointing to the same conclusion. History was edited. Someone decided that giants didn't fit the narrative. Here's what I still don't know. Where are the remains now? Who gave the order to seal those accession records? How many other anomalous specimens are still hidden? And most hauntingly, if this happened once, what's being erased from history right now, as we speak? Here's something you can do today. Go to your town's oldest courthouse or Capitol building. Measure the front door height. Take a photo. Post it in the comments. Let's build a map of America's giant architecture before it's all remodeled and updated. They don't want this discussed. Share it before it's gone. If this raised questions, subscribe. And remember this. What else don't we remember? What else have we been taught to forget?